Welcome to this CloudMaker episode of Skill Me Up. Today we're going to talk about Microsoft 365 and Azure identity management best practices and privileged identity management. My name is Dwayne Natwick. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP and a senior cloud training architect at Opsagility and Skill Me Up. I have over 30 years of industry experience. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and a regional lead for that program.
So first of all, also a good day from my side. My name is Matthyssen and I live in Belgium where I work as a cloud architect. Just like Dwayne, I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and since July of this year, I'm awarded as a Microsoft Azure MVP, which was a real honor for me. So if you ever want to reach out or just want to say hi, my socials are on the slide, so you can always contact me through my Twitter handle, for example, @Matthyssen. So Dwayne, maybe you can tell us what's on the agenda for today.
Yeah, Wim. Let's talk a little bit about what is identity management, why we use identity management. We're going to talk about Azure Active Directory for both cloud and hybrid identity management best practices for privileged accounts, and then finally we'll cover privileged identity management within Azure Active Directory. So before we discuss the Azure Active Directory and privileged identity management and those services around identity within the Azure environment and Microsoft 365 environment, Wim, why don't you talk about how we protect our security perimeter?
Well, Dwayne, these days there are all kind of cloud threats where attackers may be using techniques like social engineering, where an attacker tries to manipulate someone to give up confidential information, or ransomware, a kind of malware which encrypts a company's file or data, after which the attacker then demands a ransom to the company to restore access to the data. But there are also some new techniques attackers or hackers like to use, like acquiring Azure tenant keys from GitHub, for example, or where an attacker tries to get into an Azure VM by use of brute force or RDP SSH password spray attacks. And for example, when you're running a web server in Azure IaaS and your server is breached, attackers can also use it to install crypto mining malware and use it to, for cryptocurrency mining. So can you click to the next slide, please, Dwayne?
Sure can.
So why protecting those identities is important? And this is why, because protecting them is that important, because these days a lot of those breaches are still caused by credential theft. And we still see that a lot of users' passwords are duplicates, for example, which makes it easier for an attacker to track a password down and to get into a system or an application. And next to those, a lot of companies also still have a lot of shadow IT, where employees use non-approved apps for work-related tasks, for example. So can you click for the next slide, please, Dwayne? So, and on this slide, we see a lot of identity breaches examples. For example, you see the top 20 most popular passwords used by employees, which can be simply looked up by opening a browser and look for them in Bing or Google.
So are there any tools to check for these breached identities, Wim?
Yeah, there are. A nice website to use, for example, is haveibeenpwned.com. This site allows you to check if you have an account that has been compromised in a data breach. You simply need to type in an email address you want to validate, and then the site in the back checks if that specific account is breached. You also have the Jumbo app, which you can run on any mobile device you're using, iOS or Android, which helps you to take back control of your personal data by, for example, enabling you to easily delete old tweets or Facebook posts and even delete Alexa voice recordings. I would say try them both out. And maybe, Dwayne, you can now tell us how identity management can help us protecting our cloud identities.
Thank you, Wim. Yeah, I'll talk about that next here. What is identity management now that we know why it's important to protect our identities? There's many factors, especially in the cloud and mobile world, that requires the organization and users to protect their identity. And Wim hit on a couple of those, having not using easily guessed passwords is an important one for employees to take into account. And, why would we, what is the big thing with the big deal with identities is if somebody breaches an identity and you're not managing that properly with proper best practices in place, you're going to leave exposed sensitive information as well as personal information. If you're a healthcare organization, it could be health information, financial information for the organization as well as the employees, and it becomes a issue not just to yourself personally, but as well as the organization from an overall regulatory standpoint, government standpoint, and as well as reputational standpoint. So we talk about identity management, how identity management is used. We need to talk about what is really important to both the users and the organization. Users generally want to get to files and get to information as fast as possible. So unfortunately, that causes them to use easy to remember passwords and potentially easy to guess passwords. So, and being able to collaborate and be able to communicate with others, over somewhat open channels, leads things open for potential issues with compliance and exposure to identities. And that's where the organization comes in. They want to maintain that confidentiality and that integrity while still helping the users gain access to that information as easily as possible. Some things around, what happens in terms of threats to identity has to do with, if users are having too much of a struggle getting to applications, they tend to find ways around identity management and access policies using, with shadow IT, how organizations are managing personal devices and things like that. While the organization then needs to make sure that from an identity standpoint that they're limiting or removing admin rights that aren't necessary and that users are only having access to the files and information that they need to perform their job and don't have any elevated privileges. That's really what we're going through and talking about today. And this slide just kind of shows there are many different places where we have our identities out in the cloud and in the world today, whether it's business applications or personal applications. We have identities all over the place, and how are we securing them and using those and having policies in place to within our organization to allow what applications the users and the organization needs to get the job done. And last point regarding this is that we need to collaborate both with our external and guest users as well. And there are ways within the Microsoft 365 and Azure infrastructure to be able to take and utilize others' identities from other organizations that are utilizing those same tools to protect our organization, but also be able to collaborate with others.
So Dwayne, can you maybe give us an example on how we can use identity and access management in practice?
Yeah, let's walk through a quick workflow on how managed identities, are provisioned internally. We'll use a virtual machine managed identity that's accessing a key vault resource within this example. And, a similar workflow can apply to other services as well. So, what we look at here is we have our managed identity to the virtual machine. Our Azure Resource Manager, also known as the Azure Portal, receives a request to enable the system assigned managed identity on the virtual machine. And then that creates a service principal within Azure Active Directory for the identity of the virtual machine. And that service principal is then created on the Azure Active Directory tenant and that's associated with the subscription of that account. Next, that resource within Resource Manager, the configuration of that identity on the VM is then updated as part of the metadata of the instance for the identity endpoint with the service principal client ID as well as the certificate. Now that we have the managed identity set up, that service principal now has the information to grant access to that virtual machine, to that Azure resource. And for the Azure Resource Manager, it's now using role-based access control in Azure Active Directory to assign the appropriate role to that service principal based on how that's configured, whether it's a owner role, a contributor role, or just a viewer type role. For services, there's also the option here on the side here where how the mechanism is for the role-based access control and for the secrets and access policies to be administered through Azure Key Vault or a separate key management system rather than just managing it through the Azure environment and within the Azure resource. And that creates that separation of duties that you might want to have in terms of your keys and your secrets and your certificates. And then finally, once your code is now running on the VM and it has that token for the service endpoint, now we're accessible within the VM. A call can be made to Azure AD to request access, and the certificate then is configured, and the token is then given to access that virtual machine, and then your code, your access token is then authenticated and stored in Key Vault to maintain that authorization and have access to that resource the next time as appropriate. So that goes through a quick overview of the workflow, and we mentioned Azure Active Directory in that and some of the Azure Active Directory services. So Wim, why don't you explain Azure Active Directory and how it compares to a traditional Active Directory environment?
Azure Active Directory is a comprehensive identity and access management solution for your cloud. So you use it to use your apps, your cloud apps. It's highly scalable. It's a multi-tenant directory and service globally available across all Azure regions. So you can use it for any Azure resource you want to use it. And it lets, for example, app developers focus on building applications with fast and simple integration into world-class identity solutions and protocols, like using OAuth, OpenID Connect, and SAML. But maybe, Dwayne, it's best that you tell what the difference is between Active Directory, because we still see a lot of companies using on-premise Active Directory and try to work with Azure AD, but still don't quite know what the difference is between both. So maybe you can explain that to the audience.
Yeah, that's an important one, because the fact that Microsoft named the identity management service in Azure Active Directory has caused a lot of confusion out there, and I'm sure Wim comes across the same thing. When I'm teaching a lot of classes, you got to around Azure Active Directory, you really got to clarify what the difference is between the two. Azure Active Directory is not, it's a cloud-based identity service. It's not to be mistaken as a cloud version of Active Directory domain services, even though the name both have Active Directory in it. They perform some of the same functions in terms of authentication and authorization, but there's a lot of things around the Active Directory that are not done in terms of Azure Active Directory. And some of those examples are on the slide, such as you can't join a server to it. There's really no group policy within there. No support for LDAP or Kerberos. There aren't organizational units or forests, even though some of those can be joined within the Azure Active Directory environment. You can't create them within Azure Active Directory. And it's just really, a flat directory structure where you have your users, your groups, and your resources, and how they're authenticated within the cloud environment. So Azure Active Directory has 4 different editions. There's the free, there's the Office 365 apps version, the Premium P1, and the Premium P2. The free edition, or also the Office 365 edition, for the most part, is comes with your subscription. And even when you subscribe to Azure or Dynamics 365 or Intune, you get that free version where you can create users, you can create groups. But when you go up to the higher level editions is where you really start getting some of the additional security features and what those security features do for you and how you can create dynamic groups and things like that.
And Dwayne, can you tell us how an organization that currently uses Azure Active Directory can utilize the cloud identity management of Azure AD?
I can. Let's take a look at how a hybrid organization looks in terms of Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. Most enterprise organizations are going to fit into this mold. There are, unless you're a startup business that started up probably in the last 5 years, you're generally not going to be a cloud native organization where everything that you run is in a cloud environment. So you're going to probably have some sort of Active Directory domain service within your environment. And you're connecting both to those cloud applications of Office 365 and Teams, as well as having application servers and maybe even web servers still running in your data center with that connection. So to do that, Microsoft has within Azure, within the Azure environment and Azure Active Directory environment, the integration of services with Active Directory on premises. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide. That is utilized with Azure Active Directory Connect. So when we look at Azure Active Directory Connect, it is essentially a synchronization tool between the on-premise Active Directory services and your cloud services. So therefore, what you're able to do with that environment is now have one identity across your organization that is utilizing both your legacy Active Directory as well as your Azure Active Directory environment, and allowing you to change, to manage them in both places and provide synchronization. And we'll talk, and there's multiple ways for that architecture to be synchronized through pass-through authentication, password hash synchronization, and federated identity. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about it in this particular presentation. We could probably do another entire half day on on the different synchronization tools.
Or a few more days.
Yeah, the big thing is that that for the most part within Azure Active Directory Connect, especially with pass-through authentication, is the on-premises Active Directory identity is what always wins. So that is your single point of truth within your Active Directory environment. If you utilize most of the standard quick setup of Azure Active Directory actually uses password hash synchronization as your default, mainly because if the synchronization connection between your cloud identities of Azure Active Directory and your on-premise gets severed for some reason, you have a network go down, you only lose your access to that native Active Directory. You can still utilize your cloud services, so you can maintain some level of productivity. And that kind of bounds into seamless single sign-on. So like I said on the previous slide, having that direct connection and that synchronized connection allows us to now configure a seamless single sign-on type environment to your organization, where you're now no longer needing to log into your cloud apps as well as your on-premise apps, both through multiple authentication portals. You can now authenticate one time utilizing the Azure Active Directory Connect tool, and have the ability now to log into to all of your applications across your organization, whether they're on-premise in your on-premises data center or in the cloud. And some key points around that is that it requires you to be utilizing the password hash sync or password authentication. It's not utilized through the federated access. There's a little bit different connection to utilize federated access and having a federation server and things like that coordinated to be able to utilize that. But if you're utilizing a password hash sync or password authentication with Azure AD Connect, you can easily configure and turn on single sign-on, as long as you have utilizing modern browsers and modern authentication tactics. So Wim, as well as Azure AD Connect, I believe that Azure also has a PaaS service to utilize Active Directory.
Yeah, that's completely true, Dwayne. So next to Azure AD, you also have Azure Active Directory Domain Services, or Azure ADDS, which provides managed domain service as a PaaS service and foresees a simple deployment of a subset of fully compatible traditional ADDS features such as domain zone, group policy, LDAP, and Kerberos NTLM authentication. Next to that, it can be integrated with Azure AD, which itself then can synchronize with on-premises ADDS environment. Just keep in mind that it can only give you a single managed domain per Azure Active Directory. When you create such an Azure ADDS managed domain, you first define a unique namespace. This namespace is the domain name, such as addsmydomain.com or something else. And then in the back, two Windows Server domain controllers are deployed into your Azure region. And the nice thing, it's because it's a PaaS service, you don't need to manage those domain controllers. Microsoft will take care of everything, going from Windows updates to all the rest. So it's a nice extra domain service you can use inside your Azure environment, Dwayne.
Great. So I think what you're going to do now is jump into the portal and show a little bit of what Azure Active Directory as well as the Microsoft 365 Admin Center look like for everybody.
Yeah, so let me take control of the screen. So probably everybody's seeing my screen now. So first of all, you can manage your Azure Active Directory from the normal Azure portal. You can just go to the global search bar, type in Azure Active Directory. You can click on it. It will open. You can see, you can manage everything. You can see I'm a global admin. I have a specific license. You can see my tenant ID and so on and so on. You can also use the preview portal, for example, preview.portal.azure.com. If you want to use the new things, new features, new add-ons, only don't use it when you're working in your production environment. Only use it to test out new things and to use them. You can also use, if you want to give a specific person only rights to work with Azure Active Directory, you can go to the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and there the focus is completely the same as the Azure portal, but the focus is completely on Azure Active Directory itself. We can see no other resources are listed, and I can only use Azure Active Directory. I can use my users, and I can configure and manage my enterprise applications. And last but not least, you can also use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center if you, for example, want to add specific licenses for Office or something else to your users. Or, for example, if you want to enable MFA for your users, you can go to your active users. You can click on multi-factor authentication. It will link you through to another tab. And over here, you can see which user has multi-factor authentication enabled, which one has it enforced, or you can enable it for that specific users. So I think this covers the first demo, Dwayne. So we can go back to our slides.
Thank you, Wim. So, Wim, what are some of the best practices then around identity management?
So there are some that you can easily follow or implement. First of all, you can limit the amount of global use of global administrators. And this because users with this role have access to all administrative features in Azure AD. As a global admin, you can not only reset passwords for all users, but you can also add and manage domains and gain access to any Azure subscription or management group when a user has lost access. And that's why it's always the best practice. You should minimize the number of global administrators to 2, maximum 4 people in your organization. So that's the first one. So you can go to the next slide, Dwayne, if you want. So another thing you can do to better protect, for example, your privileged accounts is enabling multi-factor authentication, or shortly called MFA, which you can now enable for free. That's an important thing to remember. Using passwords only these days not really meets most companies' high security standards. And with the use of MFA, you will immediately increase your account security, and this by requiring multiple forms of verification to prove a user's identity whenever he signs in to any application you're using. Those authentication methods include something you know, something you have, and something you are. So, for example, you can use a username with a password and combine that with a Microsoft Authenticator app running on your mobile phone, and you probably need to open it with your finger scan. So it's a lot of steps you can use to better protect your identities. So yeah, that covers MFA in my point, I think. So, but what if MFA malfunctions? Then you're not able to log into, for example, your Azure portal. Well, to solve this, you can create 2 or maximum 3 emergency access, or like they say, break glass accounts. These accounts should be cloud-only accounts that use the onmicrosoft.com domain and should not be federated or synchronized from any on-premises environment. You should also make the global administrator role assignment permanent for them, and you should exclude them from any MFA or conditional access policies you have. It's also best to use a service admin account for them, so you don't associate them with any individual user in your organization. Use a long and complex password, at least 16 characters long. But I think in best practice, for best practice, it's better to go for at least 128 randomly generated characters. You can store this password in a password manager, or you can print it out, cut it in 2, and place the pieces in 2 different safes. So you can go to the next slide, Dwayne, if you want, for the next tip. So role-based access control, access management for your Azure resources is also an important identity security aspect you need to take care of. Luckily, with RBAC, a free-to-use authorization system built on Azure Resource Manager, you can control who has access to your Azure resources and what they can do with them and what areas they have access to. You should always implement at least a privileged access model. So just give a user the minimum access they need to fulfill their tasks. Currently there are around, I think, Dwayne, 70 built-in roles like owner, virtual machine contributor, backup contributor, backup reader, and so on. If the built-in roles don't meet your specific needs, you can also create your own custom roles. And you can base them, make a copy of an existing RBAC role and then start from over there and just adjust it where you think you need to add something else. For example, some examples of when you want to use RBAC, for example, to allow one user to manage VMs in a subscription and another user to manage the virtual network, for example. Or another example is to allow the DBA administrator, DBA, to manage all Microsoft SQL Server databases in a complete subscription. So yeah, that's covering RBAC, I think. So next slide, please, Dwayne. So I think you now can already see that manage identity security for your Azure environment and your other environments, your other Microsoft Online Service environments can be difficult. Luckily, you can now simply enable Azure AD security defaults, which makes it easier to help protect from identity-related attacks with pre-configured security settings recommended by Microsoft. Like there are, for example, requiring all users to register for Azure multi-factor authentication or blocking legacy authentication protocols, and also protecting privileged activities like access to simply just a portal. The only thing you should be aware of is that when you want to enable Azure AD security defaults and you're already using conditional access policies, you can have, if you have any conditional access policy in place, you can't enable the security defaults. So that's a small gotcha. Mm-hmm. So maybe Dwayne, you can now tell us about some more advanced ways how people can protect their users and devices in their environments.
Yeah, and you brought up conditional access policies, and I actually had that happen. I had that happen to me myself when I went to do a demo on conditional access policies, and I had the security defaults enabled. I had to go back and turn those off so that I could implement those conditional access policies. The conditional access policies are very helpful, especially in the mobile workforce type environment, because what it does is, rather, on top of the additional authentication options of passwords or MFA, or even your role-based access controls, it can provide that additional level of security, especially for users that may not have the MFA typically enabled in their everyday life. A lot of times you might see executive level people that don't want to deal with MFA, but they're traveling all around the world. And how do we now protect those users from going to potentially suspect areas, suspect countries, or locations that have been identified within the Microsoft threat intelligence to be dangerous environments? And that's where conditional access policies really come into play. They work with those potential signals and within the devices. If a device isn't updated with patch updates, that could be a signal. Mentioned like real-time risk. You find that the location or IP address range that they're trying to log in from may be at risk. An application that we've identified as a suspect application. I know in the United States we're concerned with TikTok being a security risk. We could put in a conditional access policy to require or block access to TikTok if somebody is doing that from a managed device. And then you can have the different acceptance criteria to verify your identity. I don't necessarily know why allow access is in a conditional access policy, potentially, because if they've hit that signal of being risky, I don't know why we would just let them through anyway, but definitely require MFA or block access completely are two security perimeters that we can put in place to block potential bad actors from entering our environment. And just some additional things around conditional access policies. It's going to protect our corporate resources. It's going to minimize that interference and productivity. Say when somebody's sitting within their home office or main a company office, you can allow them to communicate freely, authenticate with simply a password or single sign-on without multi-factor authentication, just because they're in a protected environment. And then when they're outside of those environments on a public network or something like that, then put those conditional access in place. Key thing around what we're talking about in terms of these next few slides is many of these additional security features require either a premium P1 or P2 license of Azure Active Directory. So these are advanced features as well. And the last one we're going to talk about in terms of the best practice section is Azure Active Directory identity protection. And identity protection is just another layer of detecting potential vulnerabilities within the organization's identities, especially those users that are of elevated privileges, and you can then configure what that response is going to be to those suspicious activities. And it's utilizing a lot of the Microsoft threat analysis, and utilizing the cognitive services and machine learning abilities in the back end of the Azure environment to look for those anomalies within people's sign-in, their sign-in, how they usually sign in, and find where there might be sign-in activity that is no longer, that is that could be something that is out of the ordinary, where somebody's now logging in within 5 minutes from 6 different locations that are 100 miles apart, things like that. Identity protection is going to then alert the security personnel, create an incident that can then be investigated. So, how about you jump back in the portal and show us how to enable security defaults, and how easily it is to just assign a role to a user within Azure Active Directory.
I'd love to. Let me go back to my Azure portal. Probably everyone is seeing my screen again. So to enable Azure security defaults, it's quite easy. Just go back into your Azure Active Directory. I'm already in there. Just scroll down, go to the properties. Scroll down completely to the bottom, click on Manage Security Defaults, and there it is. Now, luckily, I have no conditional access policies in place, so I'm able to click on No and click on Yes, so I can switch them. Otherwise, if there really is a conditional access policy in place and you didn't enable them before, you're not able to click on Yes, just like Dwayne said, because you first need to disable those. So if you want to give control to RBAC to a specific resource group, let us say, for example, I have a resource group running with some VMs in there. So let me go to that specific resource group. I think it's this one. So like you can see, I have some VMs in there. I have their NICs covers. I have availability set there. And for example, I want to give control to a specific user. And I want to give them the virtual machine contributor role, for example. I just click on access control. I just click on add role assignment. I can select the role. So let me type in virtual machine. It is typing. There it is. So I will choose the virtual machine contributor. I can select the user. I let it to Azure AD group and or server principal. For example, I will select Jeff Peters. I just click on save. You can see it's starting on the top. The role assignment is added. And to validate, you can always go to Azure Active Directory, go into your users, select that specific user. So I will select Jeff Peters. Then you can go under Manage to Azure Role Assignments. If you click on that one, you select the right subscription. That was on my production subscription, this one. And you will see he has now the virtual contributor role on that specific resource group, so we can manage all things related to virtual machines. So Dwayne, I think we can go back to the slides with this.
Yes. All right. So, talked about best practices. We've talked about Azure Active Directory. Why don't you tell everyone now, Wim, about privileged identity management in Azure Active Directory, which is a very nice feature when we're managing privileged roles.
Yep. So Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, or PIM, is an access management service that helps you better protect your privileged identities, like, for example, your global admins. PIMS enables you to manage, control, and monitor access to important resources, and not only for Azure AD or Azure resources, but also for resources from your other Microsoft Online services, such as Office 365 or Intune. And it provides you with a time-based and approval-based role activation which helps you to mitigate the risk of unnecessary or misused access permissions. A good security tip is to combine multi-factor authentication MFA with RBAC integrated with PIM. So if you go to the next slide, Dwayne, then I can tell about the PIM workflow. So if you look at the PIM workflow, first the PIM admin needs to define any user who needs to have permanent or eligible access rights. Those privileges can be time bombed. So for example, let us say valid for 2 hours, a few hours, or 3 hours, for example. Then whenever an admin user needs to perform a specific task, he needs to activate those privileges. And then everything in the back he does is logged with detailed reporting and auditing. So everything can be tracked down to the minute, almost, like we say. And yeah, it's really to keep in control of your security people or your administrators doing stuff in the Azure environment, and to be able to pinpoint them in a point of time, and to give them just enough time to do their job and just the thing they need to do. So you can go to the next slide, Dwayne, if you want. So, of course, to use PIM, a directory also must have a valid license, just like you need for conditional access, you need a specific license requirements. It's the same for PIM. For PIM, this can be an Azure Premium P2 license. It can also be an EMS E5 license, a Microsoft 365 Education A5 license, or a Microsoft 365 E5 license. Just keep in mind that when a license, like let us say your Azure AD Premium P2 license, or it can even be your trial license, for example, expires, the PIM features will no longer be available in your directory. The permanent role assignments to Azure AD roles will be unaffected, but the PIM service will no longer be available to activate, manage, or perform access reviews in any way. And also all your PIM configuration settings, all your work you've done will be removed. So keep that one in mind. So you can go to the next slide if you want, Dwayne. So Azure Active Directory access reviews enable organizations to efficiently manage group memberships, access to enterprise applications, and privileged role assignments. So what can you do with access reviews? For example, you can rectify guest user access by asking access reviews of their access to applications and memberships of groups. Reviewers can use those insights that are provided to efficiently decide whether guests should have continuous access or not. Or you can rectify employee access to applications and group memberships with access reviews. And those reviews can cover Azure AD roles, like, for example, like we already know, the global admin, or it can also be used for Azure RBAC roles, like the owner role or the user role, or user access administrator, for example. So it can be used for both of them. So next slide, please, Dwayne. To create an access review, you need to follow a few steps. First of all, you need to log in as a global administrator or a user account administrator. And then you need to go to the access review page, select this program, and then select controls, and then you need to add a control. And there you specify all necessary parameters like a name, a description. You also specify a schedule. You specify what you want to review, like this can be group memberships or application access. And then you also set the approval process and all other settings. And that's it to set it up. So you can go to the next slide if you want, Dwayne. So you can also, of course, manage those access reviews. By default, Azure AD will send an email to reviewers shortly after the review starts. If you're not to choose that Azure AD send the mail, you need to be sure that the reviewers then, that there is an access review is waiting for them to complete. But reviewers can also take action via the Azure AD Access Panel, or, for example, via the Azure AD portal. And you can track the progress as the reviewers complete their reviews in the Azure AD dashboard in the Access Review section. And you can take action based on those completed reviews. But Dwayne, after saying all of this, maybe it's better that you show how PIM works in practice.
Yeah, let's do that. Let me change my screen here quick. And as you can see, I have pinned to my Azure services here the Azure Privileged Identity Management. So if we want to add an assignment, and we can select that role from right here, say billing administrator, select a member, and I think I move user role that does not have the ability to do this right now. So let me try this again, a different account.
That one is a global admin, Dwayne, probably. This
Yeah,
one?
they both are supposed to be, but I added this to.
This one is a global admin, so now it should work.
Yep. So find my privileged identity management, manage my access, create an assignment, just make it application admin, and there we are. There we are. And let me just make this user my admin for this. And key thing here is within the eligibility and the assignment type. If I left permanently eligible checked within this, there's really not much benefit really to privileged identity management. You're not going to be doing any access reviews or anything like that. This person is then permanently eligible, and we'd have to go in and manually take that off and edit that user. What best practice would be is that we create that assignment with a start and an end time, and it defaults to 1 year. Typically you don't want to leave it open really that long unless it's a specific project, and you're not going to leave them exposed, the attack surface to exposed. Probably a good rule of thumb is to assign it to only be, depending on whether it's a project or not, maybe 30 days, maybe 24 hours, and then have them do an access review if they need more time at that point. You can set that to eligible if they don't need it right away, and then they can go in and activate it. Or if they just need to immediately have access, we can make it active right away, and provide a justification. Needs admin rights to applications. And then we just assign that, and we're ready to go at that point. And once we have assigned that role, we will see those assignments in a moment show up within our assignments. And you can see here, there's my application administrator. Since I've made it a active assignment, it can go in there as well. We can go right into that as well, though, if we want, and turn that back to eligible and save that. And once that updates, it's then going to pop into the eligible. When Dwayne admin then logs in and goes to their role assignments, they will see that they will now have this role available to them that they can then activate themselves as well. So it gives you a lot more flexibility. It decreases your identity attack surface from that standpoint, and allows you then to audit and make sure that you are not leaving elevated privileges and admin roles open to users. And that's where then you can look at these roles, and you can create your access reviews in here, and select which roles you're looking at, and go from there in terms of have our application administrator. We can set up then our access review for that particular role, and determine if we want to do that on a monthly basis, so that we're getting a best practice workflow in terms of how we're auditing these admin users. We can do that as well. And I think that brings us to a close. So So we spent a lot of time here in the last hour talking about identity management, what it is, how you can utilize Azure Active Directory as well as on-premises Active Directory for cloud and hybrid identity management, what the best practices are for identity management for your privileged accounts and for your users, and then finally, how privileged identity management then is a tool for continuously auditing your administrative rights and those privileged accounts and privileged account roles to decrease your attack surface and manage your identities within your environment. So thanks for listening to this episode of CloudMaker. I am Dwayne Natwick.
And I'm Matthyssen.
Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
Bye.